In the grand tapestry of Roman history, few threads are as dark as the Battle of Carrhae. This engagement, fought in 53 BC, represents one of the most crushing defeats ever suffered by the legions. It was a clash not just of armies, but of civilizations, the Roman Republic against the Parthian Empire. The architect of this disaster was Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man of immense wealth and even greater ambition. As a member of the first triumvirate, he stood beside giants like Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. While Caesar had Gaul and Pompey had his eastern triumphs, Crassus yearned for a military victory to cement his legacy. He saw in the wealthy, mysterious Parthian Empire an opportunity for glory and plunder. This invasion was born not of necessity, but of pure, unadulterated vanity. He assembled a massive force, 7 legions strong, totaling over 40,000 men. These were the hardened infantry that had conquered much of the known world. His ally, King Artavasdes II of Armenia, offered sound advice. He urged Crassus to take a northern route through the mountains of Armenia. The terrain there would negate the primary strength of the Parthians, their cavalry. But Crassus, arrogant and impatient, dismissed this counsel. He chose the direct path, a perilous march straight through the heart of the Mesopotamian desert. This decision would prove to be his first, and perhaps most fatal, mistake. The relentless sun and arid landscape began to sap the strength of his legions long before they saw an enemy. Opposing them was a much smaller, yet far more specialized, Parthian army. They were led by the brilliant young general known as Shurenna. Shurenna's force numbered only 10,000, a quarter of the Roman strength. But his army was composed almost entirely of cavalry. 9,000 were horse archers, masters of mobile warfare. The remaining 1,000 were the fearsome cataphracts, heavily armored shock cavalry. As the Romans trudged deeper into enemy territory, the landscape became their enemy. The flat, open plains were the perfect killing ground for Parthian tactics. Finally, near the town of Carrhae, the two armies met. Shurenna, a master of deception, initially hid the true size of his force. He had his men cover their gleaming armor with cloths and skins. The Romans advanced, seeing only a small, seemingly insignificant enemy. Then, a thunderous sound filled the air. The Parthians beat enormous kettle drums, a terrifying, deafening roar designed to instill panic. This signal, the coverings were dropped, and the desert floor glittered with the armor of 10,000 horsemen. Crassus, startled, quickly ordered his men into a defensive square. This formation was solid and defensible, but it was also static. The battle began not with a clash of swords, but with a storm of arrows. The Parthian horse archers circled the Roman square, just out of javelin range. They unleashed a relentless, continuous barrage of arrows. The Roman legionaries raised their shields, forming the famous testudo, or tortoise formation. But the Parthian composite bows were incredibly powerful. Their arrows could pierce shields and armor with sickening ease. Men screamed as shafts pinned their limbs to their shields or pierced their feet through their sandals. The Romans had hoped the Parthians would eventually run out of arrows. This hope was cruelly extinguished when they saw a long line of camels behind the Parthian cavalry. Shurenna had organized a logistical masterpiece, a mobile resupply train of ammunition. The morale of the Romans began to crumble under the ceaseless assault. Seeing a moment of hesitation, Shurenna unleashed his cataphracts. These iron-clad behemoths charged the wavering Roman line. Their long lances, or contos, outreached the Roman gladius. The charge punched through the Roman square, causing chaos and carnage. The horse archers would then swarm in, firing at the now exposed and disorganized infantry. It was a perfect, deadly combination of hammer and anvil. Crassus, desperate, made another fateful decision. He ordered his son, Publius, to lead a breakout charge. Publius, a brave and capable commander who had served with Caesar in Gaul, eagerly accepted. Took with him the best of the cavalry, archers, and infantry. The Parthian horse archers immediately turned and fled. Elated by the apparent retreat, Publius and his men gave chase. They pursued them for miles, becoming dangerously separated from the main Roman army. It was a classic Parthian tactic, the feigned retreat. Once they were sufficiently isolated, the trap was sprung. The cataphracts, who had been hiding, emerged and blocked their path of retreat. Publius and his men were surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered. They fought with the desperate courage of doomed men. Publius, wounded and seeing no hope of escape, made his final choice. He ordered his shield-bearer to kill him, choosing death over the dishonor of capture. The Parthians, victorious, committed a final, brutal act of psychological warfare. Back at the main formation, Crassus had been anxiously awaiting news of his son. He saw a group of Parthians approaching, not in attack, but in a grim procession. They were laughing and singing, and at their head, they carried the spear. The sight of his son's head shattered what was left of Crassus's resolve. The morale of the entire Roman army collapsed instantly. The Parthians renewed their attack with even greater ferocity. Fighting continued until nightfall, a mercy for the battered Romans. Under the cover of darkness, Crassus ordered a retreat. In their haste, they abandoned thousands of their wounded comrades. The next morning, the Parthians methodically slaughtered every Roman left on the field. The retreat to the walled town of Carrhae was a nightmare. Several cohorts got lost in the dark and were surrounded and annihilated. The remnants of the army that reached Carrhae were trapped and leaderless. Crassus himself was in a state of shock, unable to issue commands. Sirena, knowing the Romans were broken, offered a truce. He proposed to allow the Romans to withdraw in exchange for Crassus's presence at a negotiation. Crassus, deeply suspicious, refused to go. However, his own mutinous troops, desperate to escape, forced him to attend the peace conference. The meeting was, as Crassus feared, a trap. A scuffle broke out, and in the ensuing chaos, Crassus and his generals were cut down. Legend tells a grim story about his final moments. To mock his infamous greed, the Parthians supposedly poured molten gold down his throat. His head was then sent to the Parthian king, Orodes II. It arrived just in time to be used as a prop in a performance of Euripides' play, The Bacchae. Actor playing Agave, who carries the head of her son Pentheus, used the real head of Crassus. The defeat at Carrhae was absolute. Of the more than 40,000 Romans who marched into Mesopotamia, 20,000 were killed. Another 10,000 were captured and became prisoners of the Parthian Empire. These prisoners were famously settled in the far eastern city of Merv, never to see Rome again. Only a quarter of the original army, led by the quaestor Cassius, managed to escape back to Syria. The captured legionary eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, were a source of deep shame for Rome. Their recovery would become a major political and military objective for decades to come. The death of Crassus also had profound political consequences. He was the financial and political anchor of the first triumvirate. With him gone, The rivalry between Caesar and Pompey intensified, unchecked. This imbalance would directly lead to the Great Roman Civil War. The Battle of Carrhae taught Rome a bitter lesson. It demonstrated the supremacy of mobile, ranged cavalry in open terrain. The legion, supreme in close-quarters combat, was not invincible. Rome would adapt, eventually incorporating more cavalry and ranged units into its armies. But the memory of Carrhae, of the dust, the arrows, and the golden mockery would haunt the Roman psyche for centuries. It stood as a permanent, chilling reminder that even the mightiest empire could be humbled. The sands of Mesopotamia had drunk the blood of a legion, fueled by one man's vanity. The Parthian victory was complete, a tactical masterpiece that would be studied by military leaders for ages. Crassus sought immortality through conquest. Instead, he found it in a humiliating, legendary defeat. The desert wind whispers no tales of his glory. It only carries the echo of 10,000 arrows in flight. The Roman soldiers were disciplined, but their spirit was broken by the unfamiliar tactics. The heat was an oppressive, silent enemy, draining strength and hope. Murina's cataphracts were like living statues of iron and bronze. Their charge was not just a physical attack, but a psychological one. The loss of Publius was the turning point from a battle to a massacre. Crassus's grief rendered him useless as a commander. The flight to Carrhae was a desperate scramble for survival. The walls of the town offered only a brief, false respite. The mutiny against Crassus was born of pure terror and a desire to live. The final parley was a stage set for a murder. The story of the molten gold became a cautionary tale against greed throughout the ancient world. Captured legionaries faced a life of exile at the edge of the known world. The Parthian Empire, for a time, secured its western border against Roman expansion. Carrhae was more than a battle. It was a collision of military philosophies. The heavy infantry of Rome had met its match in the mobile cavalry of Parthia. The defeat forced Rome to innovate and adapt its legendary military machine. The name Murena would be remembered as a master tactician, a giant killer. The tragedy of Publius was that his Gallican bravery was useless in the desert. Roman supply line was stretched thin, while the Parthians was mobile and ever-present. The psychological impact of the kettle drums cannot be overstated. The Roman square, a fortress of men, became their own prison. Every Roman casualty from the arrow storm was a victory for Parthian strategy. The cataphract's charge was the decisive, brutal punctuation to the battle. The desert itself seemed to be an ally to the Parthians, who knew its ways. Crassus's failure to heed the Armenian king's warning sealed his fate before the first arrow flew. The battle was a testament to the idea that numbers do not guarantee victory. The shame of the lost eagles would fuel Roman foreign policy for a generation. The civil war that followed the triumvirate's collapse reshaped Rome forever. Carrhae was not the end of Rome, but it was the end of its innocence. It proved that the world was larger and more dangerous than many in the Senate believed. The Parthian horse archer remains an iconic figure of military history. The story of Carrhae is a timeless lesson in the dangers of arrogance and cultural underestimation. The final image of Crassus is not of a general, but of a prop in a play, the ultimate mockery.